Nick Herbert, welcome to TNG this morning, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom.
Now, you briefed the Cabinet this week on your new role as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on LGBT rights. Can you share that briefing with us? What did you tell them what the role actually is, and what is it that the PM wants you to do?
Well, I think it's highly significant that the PM has made this appointment. It's the first time we've had an envoy on these issues in the UK, and not many countries make such appointments. President Biden has just done so, and I'm looking forward to working with his envoy, who I know. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that the Prime Minister wants to give prominence to these issues. He wants me, in his words, to supercharge the UK's global leadership on LGBT rights, to work with Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office ministers on those issues. He also wants me to support the domestic agenda on LGBT rights. And specifically, I'm going to be chairing a major international LGBT conference that the government is hosting next year, a year from now, called Safe to Be Me, which is going to be really the first global event of its kind, because it's going to bring together ministers from other countries, civil society activists, experts, business people, I hope religious leaders, parliamentarians from all around the world, with the aim of promoting LGBT rights. And I think it will be one of the most significant events of its kind ever held. And that's what I was briefing the Cabinet on. And I think it was a reflection of the importance that the Prime Minister attaches to these issues, the lead that he wants the UK to show, and the progress he wants us to continue to make.
I think the need for an LGBT envoy around the world is quite obvious. A lot of countries, of course, have not caught up with Britain's or America's leading record. But what is the need for one at home? Why is there a need to continue pushing a cause which I think a lot of people would say has already achieved a huge amount here?
I think we have achieved a huge amount, and I don't think we should dismiss that or underplay it. You know, I mean, just this week we saw the Methodist Church announced that it was going to allow same-sex marriages. Well, that's because of the legislation that we passed to enable same-sex marriages. And this week, the Prime Minister hosted a Pride event at number 10 Downing Street, and the first couple, or one of the first couples, gay couples that got married under the new legislation in Northern Ireland that we passed, attended, and it was very moving listening to their story and the fact that they've been able to get married, whereas they wouldn't have been done before. But also there was a young man, Josh, who just 2 weeks earlier had been mugged horribly outside a nightclub in Liverpool. And I think it was, you know, quite a powerful reminder that there are still issues, that in spite of the huge progress that we've made, there is still some residual prejudice and work to do. And the Prime Minister talked to Josh, he talked to Chris and John, the gay couple. We also had, by the way, veterans who had come along to tell us about how they'd had their medals returned under the government's policy, which now ensures that they can have their medals back when they were disqualified because they were forced out of the armed forces under the previous policy where you weren't allowed to be gay. And all of the stories that were being told by these individuals were just a reminder of how important it is that we do have what the Prime Minister called a culture of kindness, tolerance, openness. And I do think there's work to do in certain areas, and that's one of the things that I'm looking at. We've made, you know, great progress just actually in the last few months on certain issues. So I mentioned the Northern Ireland issue on same-sex marriage, but we've also just changed the law on blood donations so that if you're in a long-term relationship with a same-sex partner, you can give blood, whereas previously there'd been a blanket ban that was discriminatory because it wasn't based on the issue of safety. We're rolling out PrEP in England to make it available as a matter of course on the NHS. I mentioned the medals policy, and crucially, we're going to be banning the abhorrent practice of conversion therapy, which is the attempt to try and erase or repress or change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And the fact that we're having to do that, that we're having to look at legislation that will do that, is just an example. You know, there are still things we have to do here at home, but there is also a huge agenda abroad, as you mentioned. I think it's a sort of tale of two worlds, actually, Tom. You know, I think we see some countries that have made, you know, really fantastic progress, but we see other countries that are going backwards. And recently, we've seen the arrest of LGBT citizens in Ghana and Uganda, and very recently we've seen Hungary pass absolutely shameful discriminatory laws against LGBT people that actually have echoes of the Clause 28 laws that we wrongly passed here a long time ago. And you know, that's on our doorstep. That's a European country, and it's just a reminder that we really have to guard against these human rights infringements, and we have to take a stance on them. And that's what the Prime Minister wants us to do.
Domestically, you just mentioned gay conversion therapy, and new legislation coming from the government. Government said last month it was going to ban that. Now, that's opposed by some church groups, some churches who say it should be up to them if they want to try and persuade people to change their sexuality. It's a free speech thing. What's your response to that?
No, I don't think that's right. We're going to publish a technical consultation later this year that will look at how the legislation should be framed, and so it can address these issues. But that consultation won't be about whether we should do this. And we can't have, in my view, a blanket exemption that allows religious practices or conversion therapy under the guise of a religious practice to continue, because that would just undermine the whole purpose of the ban. I mean, these are, you know, abhorrent so-called therapies that aim to erase or repress or change someone's sexual orientation or their general or their gender identity. People are coerced into taking part in these so-called therapies. They do tremendous harm to people, and there has been very strong denunciation of these practices by religious leaders. So I don't believe that we will be going against the views of religious leaders. Our own bishops here in our country have spoken out against this practice. The synod has, and we can't allow the idea that simply because something is called a religious practice that it can do harm. And we've never allowed that in legislation. We don't allow hate speech where it does harm. There of course have to be limits to religious freedom. We must respect it where possible, but not where it's harmful. And I think we have to be clear about that.
I just ask you about the Safe to Be Me conference, the international conference that you'll host in London next year. There are 35 different Commonwealth countries where homosexuality is currently illegal. We're, of course, a proud member, potentially the leader of the Commonwealth. Would you be inviting those 35 countries to come?
Well, I think the whole purpose of the conference is to try and address those issues. One of the three key themes we want to have at the conference is the need to decriminalize in the countries where there are laws that ban people from being who they are and want to be.
So invite them.
And I think we should invite those countries, and there is an active debate going on in many of those countries. I mean, there are 69 countries around the world that still criminalize same-sex activity. A lot of those are countries where frankly, it was the legacy of Britain's colonial laws. And so we have a kind of moral responsibility here, but equally, we've got to be careful not to be seen to dictate to countries that have to take their own decisions on this. So what we want to do is help them in the process of decriminalising, and that was set out by the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, to the Commonwealth Conference. We've got a very active programme to do that. There are some Commonwealth countries that are looking at this, and we want to support them. You know, there are some countries that still have the death penalty in relation to this, which is clearly unacceptable, and you know, it's really runs against the whole principle of our international human rights laws and the Commonwealth's own charter. So I think there's an opportunity to make progress there, and the conference will also be focused on the issue of violence, where clearly we globally need to take a very strong stand against situations where there's violence against LGBT people, as we saw, for instance, in Chechnya, and we did introduce sanctions in relation to that, and also to promote equal access to healthcare, because things like HIV/AIDS programs are very impeded where there is discrimination against LGBT people. So there will be multiple strands to the conference, and I hope that there will be declarations. But yes, we would like to invite countries that want to have this conversation with us to the conference. And the conference is about dialogue. It's about how we can make progress, and about how we can encourage those countries to move forward. And it won't necessarily all be in one go. I think we sometimes forget here that in the UK, we made steady progress on these issues. We didn't do everything in one fell swoop. And so I think we have to be respectful of countries that want to change, to encourage them to change, but to take a stance where they do things that we think are wrong.
I've got so much to get through, so let's try and I'll make my question shorter if you can. Possibly shorten the answers, and we'll cut that bit, obviously. Nick, let's talk a little bit about you personally. Now, some might say, a former Conservative MP, former Conservative minister, you're a skeptic, Countryside Alliance supporter, quite an unusual character to be an LGBT champion. What's your response?
Well, my response would be that LGBT people aren't owned by any political party and have, a variety of views and opinions, just as any other citizen should do. And one of the things that I'm proudest of is the way in which, over the course of the last few years, we've been able to largely depoliticize these issues. In the UK, there is cross-party support on LGBT issues. Tony Blair started off under his government the process, which was, I think, very important of securing equality, but it was picked up and continued by the Conservative government. And I played a big role in supporting the equal marriage legislation when I was in the House of Commons. Then I've been working globally. I first of all set up the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global LGBT Rights in the House of Commons. And then I set up the Global Equality Caucus, working with parliamentarians all around the world. And I've traveled all around the world, talking to governments and members of parliament about how they can make progress on these issues. So I think it's really about the stance on these issues. And I'm very often meeting politicians who have very different views on lots of other issues. We might not agree. That's beside the point. We can agree about these fundamental issues of human rights.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? When you realized you were gay, when you came out, what age were you?
I came out relatively late, and but I was, by the time that I stood to be for Parliament in just before the 2005 general election, I was out, and I then, as a result, became the first sort of openly gay person to be selected for a safe seat by the Conservative Party. And that was
you were in the closet, so to speak, for quite some time into what your 20s.
No, I was. I think I come from a generation where it was kind of harder to come out, and one of the fantastic changes that there've been is that people do feel more secure and accepted and able to do that earlier, but not in all circumstances, and we have to just sort of remember that. I do think that the change that there's been in Parliament is sort of reflective of the wider change that there's been in our society about attitudes to LGBT people. And although I was the first openly gay Conservative member of Parliament to be elected, actually there are many openly gay members of Parliament in all political parties now, and I think Parliament is quite representative there. Where I think it would be great if we could make progress would be if we had a transgender member of Parliament, which they do in other parliaments around the world, and they're members of the Global Equality Caucus that I set up, and I think it would really help to change debate in this country if we could have more trans people in leading positions in our in our national life here.
So you knew you were gay for some time before you came out, did you?
Yeah, I think people do. And I think what happens is people wrestle with it. And it's one of the reasons I think conversion therapy can be so insidious, because you're setting up a sort of terrible conflict with people internally between, on the one hand, not coming to terms with their own sexual orientation or perhaps their gender identity, and on the other, not being so free to be who they are. And I think, when you come out, you do feel kind of honest and powerful. And I think it changes the person you are. And I think one of the reasons I feel so strongly about these issues is not just that it's a matter of sort of fundamental human rights and respect for the dignity of individuals, and that we should have a society that is open and tolerate, but also people can't fulfill their potential unless they can be who they want to be. And that's not just bad for them, it's bad for the country. And the Prime Minister made these points very strongly actually this week at the reception, because as Mayor of London, he saw the power of these issues, not just in terms of social justice and human rights, but also that if a country is open, if it's liberal and tolerant, then it's also attractive, and it's good for the country, and it's good for the economy. And that's the kind of country we want to be.
A lot of people who have come out, friends of mine who are gay, said the hardest conversations they had to have was with their parents and their closest friends. Is that the same with you?
Yeah, I think that's true. And, you look back at it afterwards and you wonder how you could possibly have been concerned when your parents, as mine were and are, were so absolutely brilliant about it. But it is also true that there are some kids that come out whose parents are not supportive. And, I've met gay people who have been ostracized, actually not so much in this country, but when I've been in other countries, and perhaps because of very strong religious views. In the main, I don't think that's true and is the case, because I think there has been a change in attitudes, and I would never want to discourage someone from coming out. But there is still lots of work we need to do with young people in schools, and also I think to have role models to make people realize that in all walks of life, there is acceptance and kindness and tolerance of gay people, and that it should no longer be an issue. And that's why, for me, watching Harry Kane this week with a rainbow armband, I found that incredibly moving, because there can be no more potent symbol in our country at the moment than England's captain. And I think the fact that he did that shows the change in football, the change in our national life, the change in attitudes to this. And what more powerful message could you be sending to young people, that it really is okay, and it will be okay. So I would never want to discourage people from coming out. And I think most families continue to be loving. What we've got to do is ensure that we can pick up and support in the exceptional cases where that isn't so, and that can lead to real problems of things like homelessness and so on. And we've got to ensure that we're able to help.
Let me ask you about the Prime Minister's commitments to LGBT rights. He hosted that Pride procession in the back garden of town. We also saw him celebrating Harry Kane's goal with you there in the background. But it wasn't just papers that I used to work for, The Sun, 20 years ago, that were outing gay cabinet ministers. Certain Daily Telegraph columnists, called Boris Johnson, around the same period, quite famously wrote about tank-topped, let me get this right, let me answer that question again, in fact, you know what's coming. It wasn't just The Sun, who I used to work for 20 years ago, who were outing gay cabinet ministers. Thankfully, that doesn't happen any longer. There was also a certain Daily Telegraph columnist at the time, Boris Johnson, who quite famously wrote about tank-topped bomb boys in the Ministry of Sam, referring to gay people. Should he apologise for that comment now?
Well, I know that he did write that. All I can tell you is about the Boris Johnson that I talk about these issues with and know, and the action that he's taken. I've walked with Boris Johnson on Pride marches. I saw his record as mayor. I've seen his voting record, where he voted against the party whip then in relation to repealing clause 28. I know that this global conference that we're holding next year is because, as Foreign Secretary, he wanted to do it. I know that as Foreign Secretary, one of the first things he did was to say that the rainbow flag should be flown over our embassies and government buildings. I know how he spoke this week to the cabinet and to the event about his commitment to these issues, and I know the things that he's initiating within the government to drive forward. So yeah, I mean, I think we can, you know, there may be things we've all said in the past that and so on, but I don't think he should be judged by things that he may have said
Well,
as a
he's
provocative
may not
Daily
being
Telegraph
judged, but it's just, should he
columnist.
say
I
sorry?
certainly don't.
Should he say sorry for the offence he caused a lot of people then?
You know, I just don't want to dwell on something that I think just doesn't represent him or his views or our views, the views of the government, and all the really great things we're doing on these issues and the great stance that he's taking. You know, I've been appointed the UK's first ever envoy, his envoy by him. You know, that is a statement in itself. I know that he is genuine about these issues, and I know what he wants to do, and that's how I judge him, and that's how I hope other people will judge him. I think he genuinely minds about these issues.
Okay, let's move on and talk about trans rights, because you did mention that just briefly. It's been a hot topic of debate. How far should the line go? A lot of women have kicked back to say they need safe spaces. They don't want transsexual people in loos with them, for example. Where do you stand on that debate? Should women be able to have their own spaces?
I mean, we do have a sort of carefully balanced law on these issues, and the government thinks that we should retain that. There is a sort of very angry debate going on, and it's become very fierce in social media and indeed in the mainstream media, and there are kind of sides in that debate where there is very strong disagreement. And what I've just been trying to say is, can we not lose sight of the fact that, you know, there are, you know, trans people who need support. You know, they need support with healthcare, they need kindness, and they need us to accept who they are and want to be. And they get caught up in the ferocity of these debates. I think there should be free speech where it's not harmful. I do think people should be right to express their views, and those that have, you know, very strong views about women's rights, of course, they should be allowed to promote those, as those who have very strong views about trans rights. But I don't think the tenor of the debate has helped trans people, and that's what I'm concerned about. So I'm very focused on, if you like, the practical things we can do to support and help trans people. And I don't want us to get involved in some of these debates where actually the law has already struck a careful balance, where we don't need to get involved, and where frankly we should just try not to engage in any kind of culture war.
But it might be for the government to have to decide whether biological women should be allowed to go to the loo in a space where only they are allowed to.
Well, the government, you know, the law has already been struck on these issues, and the government has no plans to change that. And there are lots of areas in relation to transgender right where those sensible balances and exemptions from the Equality Act are allowed, and that I think will continue. I think we should just be very careful about, if you like, exploding these issues to make them into a kind of wider debate. I mean, we have, after all, accepted for 17 years, when the Gender Recognition Act was passed, that people can legally change their identity if they want to, and we've supported them to do so, and we should continue with that. And that is the global standard. That is, if you like, the international law, and we should continue to subscribe to that. Now, there are those that don't accept that should be allowed, but that has been the policy in our country for 17 years. And so I don't think we should go back on that. I think we should focus on the practical things that we can do to support and help trans people. And I think we should be, you know, wary about getting into debates that we don't need to get into, and that lose sight of the need to support trans people, and also not allow this to distract from that I think is a broader agenda in relation to LGBT issues, both here and abroad.
What about the self-definition route? Because a previous Tory government equalities minister brought forward legislation to allow trans people to self-identify their gender without the need for an operation. Now, the current equalities minister has withdrawn that legislation, and the law is remaining that you do need to undergo physical procedures. Where do you stand?
Well, the government decided not to proceed with the idea of self-certification in relation to changing your gender identity. But just to be clear, the law does allow you to change your gender identity legally. It's just that you need to have a medical certificate and so on to do that. We have made that process cheaper and easier. And we want to do that. So the government took that decision. I don't think that, and that stands. I don't think it should be allowed to distract us from the many things that we can do, including for trans people and so on. Some countries have in the world have moved towards self-certification. Others haven't. But I just think we need to try and avoid turning this into a major argument in which trans people get, horribly caught up, because it becomes so ferocious in the media and social media that they feel themselves to be under attack.
Well, some in government, you know this as well as I do, are pushing quite unashamedly for that sort of culture war. They want the government to take sides in what is quite a furious debate about what the country should feel like. They want the government to take the side of the perhaps more traditional views. We've heard that about England cricket team, this whole kicking back against woke. Does that trouble you, that you might get some innocent victims in all this who may be trans people, maybe some LGBT people?
I've said that I don't like the idea of any kind of culture war on these issues on either side. And I am concerned about that. And I am concerned about the...
Oh. Nick, I think we've lost you. I don't know if you can still hear us.
Well, I mean, we've got 30 minutes of audio.
I know, but we need more. Sorry, we're just going to push back these pre-read.
Oh, he's gone.
God, that was such a good answer as well. The thing he's going on and on and on. I need to get to the point. Nick, can you still hear us?
Oh, sorry, I lost you for a sec.
Got you back. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let's just make sure we're recording.
Okay, we are recording.
Sorry, we're going on a bit, but I've got just about 2 more questions. But
yeah, that's fine.
We'll get there. We'll get there shortly. Let me just. We're still recording.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you that one again. Nick, some in government are quite actively pushing for a culture war across all wakes of this sort of debate, across sexuality, across religion, across race, and across traditions, because they really want the government to take a more traditional view, to kick back hard against woke. Does that sort of mentality trouble you?
Well, I've said before that I don't think that there should be any culture war on these issues on either side. I think that ends up hurting LGBT people, and I don't want to see it. And I think it distracts from the practical things we need to do to support people. And I believe that that's the view the Prime Minister takes, and that's why he said to the Cabinet this week that he wants to see kindness, tolerance, openness. That's why he held the Pride reception where he delivered the same message. That's why we're doing the things in government we're trying to do to support LGBT people. That's why we're holding the International Global LGBT Conference next year. That's why he's appointed me as Envoy. He is sending a very clear message about this, and I think he's right to do so.
Various government departments are being urged to withdraw from Stonewall's Diversity Champions programme. The argument is Stonewall just simply going too far, being far too prescriptive. Where do you stand? Do you think Stonewall have gone too far?
Well, actually, departments aren't being urged to do that. There's been no such guidance.
Well, privately they are, and there is debate going on inside Whitehall. Ministry of Justice is already actively withdrawing from the Stonewall programme?
Yeah, one or two departments have, and they may have particular reasons for doing so. But there has been no edict that they should, and we are in discussions with Stonewall about the things we need to do to continue to promote LGBT rights domestically and internationally. They are one of the civil society partners in the international conference that we are holding next year. You know, I think Stonewall has done brilliant work over the years to promote equality. And when we were talking, for instance, about marriage equality and the Methodist Church decision this week to allow it, well, Stonewall were one of the key groups that helped us to lobby on that. Now, I'm sure that, you know, not every position on Stonewall is agreed with by the government. That's true of lots of NGOs, but we should continue to have, you know, a dialogue with them and be willing to talk about where we have differences and say, well, there are certain things that they might be pressing for. Well, we're not willing to do that. And self-certification in relation to gender identity and trans issues, well, that was one of the disagreements. So it shouldn't, I think, stop us about all the areas where we do agree and they do important work. And that's about having a sensible relationship with NGOs. That I think
you wouldn't like to see ministries pulling out of the Stonewall programme?
No, I think there is a, you know, there is an issue about the fact that lots of different ministries seem to be signing up to the program rather than government as a whole. I think the civil service as a whole do sign up to it. So I'm sure that there are sensible discussions that we can have. But I wouldn't like to see the government in any way kind of take a side in what some are seeing clearly as a culture war on these issues. You know, I don't think that's what the government should be doing. I don't think that's what the Prime Minister wants us to do. And just to be clear, you know, that there is no edict that has gone around asking departments to withdraw from the scheme.
Finally, let me ask you about something wholly unrelated to your new brief and your new job, but it's slightly topical. You were the chief executive of Business for Sterling in 1988, campaigning for the No campaign against Britain adopting the euro. Quite a successful campaign it was. And you hired a certain young Dominic Cummings. In fact, you gave him his first job in British politics. Do you now regret doing that?
That's the problem about doing interviews with seasoned political journalists like you, Tom. Is you know too much and so on. Look, I gave Dominic Cummings his first job, but also I gave George Eustice, who's now the DEFRA Secretary, his first job there at Business for Sterling, and Neil O'Brien, who's now one of the Prime Minister's advisors and the MP for Harborough, and Andrew Hornby, who is the director or was the director of Reform, and lots of other brilliant people who pursued their careers in politics, and they did a brilliant job at the time in helping us to keep out of the euro.
Deftly handled. You've still got some of your ministerial skills, but I mean, you know, Dominic, are you saddened the fact he's dishing so much dirt on the Prime Minister now?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's always sad, isn't it, when your friends fall out and so
He's still your friend.
I don't like to see that, obviously, and I'm, you know, I'm very strongly support the Prime Minister and what he's trying to do, and so on. I'm very engaged in another sort of activity that I do in Whitehall reform, and what we need to do to improve the way our country is governed, and so on. So, you know, I look at what others are saying with great interest, but I've always refrained from commenting.
Okay.
And I'm not going to now.
Definitely ducked indeed. Nick Herbert, Lord Herbert, the Prime Minister's new envoy for LGBT. Thanks so much for talking to us on TNG this morning.